They say the biggest mistake you can ever make is deciding a man's worth before he opens his mouth. A young officer made that mistake one cold October night. He looked at a man walking home in a hooded sweatshirt and decided he already knew everything about him. He was wrong about all of it. Because the man in that hooded sweatshirt was not a stranger to the law. He was the law, a senior prosecutor for the United States Department of Justice, and within a matter of weeks, that single arrest would empty a police station, end careers that had taken decades to build, and put an entire city on its knees. This is the story of the night the wrong man was put in handcuffs, and the quiet reckoning that followed. The wind came down off the hills that evening, the way it always did in late October, carrying the smell of wood smoke and wet leaves through the oak-lined streets of Somerset. It was one of those small, tucked-away neighborhoods just outside the nation's capital, a place of tall colonial houses and manicured lawns, of long driveways and porch lights that glowed like small yellow moons. After dark, the loudest sound was usually the rustle of the trees or the soft hum of a car easing into a garage for the night. It was 1:45, and Nathaniel Hayes was walking home. At 42, Nathaniel was a deputy chief in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, with an office in the great limestone building downtown that bore Robert Kennedy's name. For 6 long months he had been living inside a single enormous case, a federal investigation into corruption inside a major city's police force. His days were an endless procession of subpoenas, sworn testimony, and mountains of documents. By nightfall, his mind felt like a radio caught between 2 stations, humming and restless and unwilling to go quiet. So he had a ritual, and he kept it faithfully. Every night, no matter how late he came home with his briefcase full, he would trade his tailored suit for a pair of worn gray sweatpants, a comfortable pair of running shoes, and a faded navy sweatshirt from Georgetown, where he had gone to law school many years before. He would leave his phone and his wallet on the kitchen counter, step out his own front door, and walk a slow 2-mile loop around the neighborhood he had lived in for the better part of a decade. It was the only time in his day that belonged entirely to him. It was when he did his best thinking and his best breathing. It was when he stopped being a federal prosecutor and remembered how to be a man. That night he was tired all the way down to his bones. He pulled the hood up over his head against the chill, pushed his hands into his pockets, and dropped his chin, turning over the day's arguments in his mind, as his feet carried him along the familiar sidewalk. He turned onto Cumberland Avenue, 3 short blocks from his own front door, so lost in thought that he never noticed the pair of headlights creeping along behind him. Officer Mitchell Carver was 26 years old, 2 years out of the academy, and restless in a way that had started to curdle into something else. He had been assigned to the night shift for the small municipal force that patrolled Somerset, an easy posting in a quiet, low-crime town. To the older men in the department, it was a reward. To Carver, it felt like a cage. He wanted arrests. He wanted the kind of story you could tell in the break room. He wanted the veterans to look at him and see a hunter instead of a rookie who wrote parking tickets. His cruiser rolled around the corner without its lights flashing, and through the windshield his eyes landed on a single figure, a tall man in a dark sweatshirt, hood up, walking slowly through one of the wealthiest streets in the county at nearly midnight. To Nathaniel, he was simply a neighbor walking off a hard day. To Officer Carver, he was something that did not fit, and things that did not fit, Carver had decided long ago, were things worth stopping. Carver killed his headlights and trailed the man from a distance. He watched him pause at the edge of a driveway and bend down, only to tie a loose shoelace, though Carver's imagination filled in a darker story. He pressed the accelerator, and the cruiser surged forward through the silent street, coming to a hard stop a dozen feet from where Nathaniel was crouched. Before Nathaniel could even straighten up, the cruiser's spotlight came to life, a wall of white light that swallowed the whole street and left him blinking and blind. He raised a forearm to shield his eyes. "Stop right there. Keep your hands where I can see them." The voice came booming out of the loudspeaker, young and sharp and wound tight. Nathaniel went still. Here is the thing about Nathaniel Hayes that Officer Carver could not have known. This man had spent his entire career studying nights exactly like this one. He had reviewed hundreds of these encounters, frame by frame, word by word. He knew the statistics by heart. He understood, better than almost anyone alive, how quickly a moment like this could tip from a misunderstanding into a tragedy. And he knew that the single most dangerous thing he could do was make a sudden move. "Get your hands out of your pockets now." The cruiser door swung open. Officer Carver stepped out, one hand resting on his holstered weapon. Slowly, deliberately, Nathaniel drew his empty hands from his pockets and raised them, palms open and facing forward. When he spoke, it was in the calm, even baritone that had commanded federal courtrooms for years. "My hands are visible, officer. Is there a problem?" Carver came around the front of the cruiser, chest out, shoulders squared, playing the part he had rehearsed in his head 100 times. He shone a flashlight straight into Nathaniel's face. "What are you doing out here?" "I'm taking a walk," Nathaniel answered, keeping his voice level. "I live right around the corner." Carver let out a short, unfriendly laugh. "You live around here? A walk in the dark, looking into people's driveways." I stopped to tie my shoe. And inside, the prosecutor's mind was already at work, quietly cataloging everything that was happening. No reasonable suspicion, no probable cause. A stop built on nothing but a man's appearance and the neighborhood he happened to be standing in. "I have a right to walk on a public sidewalk, officer," Nathaniel said. "Am I being detained?" The words hung in the cold air for a moment. Carver did not like it when people used the language of the law. It felt like a trick. It felt like defiance. It felt like this stranger was reaching for something Carver could not see. "You're detained until I say you're not," Carver snapped, stepping closer. "Let me see some identification." "I don't have my ID with me," Nathaniel said. "I left my wallet at home, which, again, is 3 blocks from here. I'm happy to give you my name and my address." "No ID." Carver's voice climbed with something that sounded almost like triumph. "Convenient. Turn around. Hands in the air." Nathaniel did not move at once. "Officer, under state law you need a specific, reasonable suspicion that a crime has been committed, is being committed, or is about to be committed, before you can demand my identification or detain me. What crime do you believe I've committed?" It was the calm, and the certainty, and the perfect recitation of the law that lit the fuse. Carver did not see a citizen exercising his rights. He saw a man who would not obey. "I said turn around." What happened next happened fast, and it did not need to happen at all. Carver reached out, took hold of Nathaniel's wrist, and pushed him forward against the pavement. The suddenness of it took Nathaniel off his feet. He went down hard onto the cold sidewalk, and the fall split his lip against his own teeth. "Stop resisting," Carver was saying, loud and for the record, though the man beneath him was not fighting at all. It was the old script, the words that get said for the microphone rather than for the truth. He brought a knee down against Nathaniel's back and pinned him there. "I am not resisting," Nathaniel said quietly, his cheek against the concrete. And the truth was that the humiliation stung worse than anything else. He was a senior official of the United States government, a man who briefed the Attorney General of the United States. And here he was, held to the sidewalk of the street where he paid his property taxes, treated like a criminal for the crime of walking home. The handcuffs came out, and Carver clicked them tight, too tight, around Nathaniel's wrists. Across the street, a porch light flicked on. The front door of number 402 opened a careful few inches. Susan Abernathy, a retired pediatrician who had stood in Nathaniel's own backyard at a neighborhood barbecue just 3 weeks earlier, peered out into the dark, her hand at her mouth. "Up," Carver ordered, pulling Nathaniel to his feet. Nathaniel stood, swaying slightly, a thin line of blood at the corner of his mouth marking the Georgetown letters across his chest. But when his eyes finally found Carver's in the amber light of the street lamp, there was no fear in them at all. There was only a deep, patient, unnerving calm, the look of a man who has just been handed the one thing his adversary should never have given him. "You've made a very serious mistake tonight, officer," Nathaniel said softly. "Save it for the judge," Carver said, patting him down and finding nothing but a ring of house keys. "You're going downtown. Suspicion of prowling. Failure to identify. Resisting arrest." He guided Nathaniel to the cruiser and eased him into the back seat, shut the door, and picked up his radio. "Dispatch, Unit 4. I've got one in custody. Male, suspicious person, resisting. Heading to the station for booking. Copy, Unit 4, the dispatcher answered. Carver slid behind the wheel and caught Nathaniel's eyes in the rearview mirror, a small, satisfied smile on his face. Should have just carried your ID, pal. Nathaniel said nothing. He sat quietly in the dark, the cuffs biting into his wrists, and he did not waste another word on the patrolman. He was finished talking to Officer Carver. He was ready, now, to talk to the department. The municipal station was a low building of gray cinder block that smelled faintly of bleach and old coffee. At midnight, the booking area was nearly empty. One bored clerk at a keyboard, and behind the desk, the shift supervisor, Sergeant Louis Gable. Gable was a 20-year veteran, a graying, heavy-set man who wanted nothing more from his remaining years than to reach his pension without a single major headache. He looked up as the double doors slid open, and Officer Carver came marching in, one hand around the arm of a tall man whose sweatshirt was marked with blood. "Look what I found," Carver announced, a bounce in his step. "Caught this one out in Somerset. Gave me a hard time. Wouldn't show ID." Gable sighed and rubbed his tired eyes. "All right, bring him to the desk. Empty his pockets." Carver set a single ring of keys on the metal counter. No wallet, no phone. Says he lives in the neighborhood. He said it as though it were the funniest thing he had heard all week. Gable studied the man in front of him. He was bleeding, but he stood unnaturally straight. He did not have the jittery look of a petty thief, nor the unsteady sway of a man who had been drinking. He simply stood there in the cuffs, with a stillness that Gable, after 20 years, found difficult to place. "Name?" Gable asked, his fingers over the keyboard. "Nathaniel Hayes." The voice was smooth and deep, and carried the clarity of a man used to being listened to. "Address? 415 Cumberland Avenue, Chevy Chase." Carver snorted. "Sure, that's a $3 million house." Gable shot the young officer a look that told him to be quiet, then turned back. "Mr. Hayes, since you don't have identification on you, we'll need to run your prints to confirm who you are before we can process anything. Step over to the glass." Carver unlocked the cuffs, but kept a firm hand on Nathaniel's shoulder and walked him to the digital scanner. Nathaniel complied without a word, pressing each finger to the glowing green glass. The moment the prints were captured, Carver snapped the cuffs back on and steered him into a holding cell, a small concrete room with a metal bench and a reinforced window, and turned the lock. "Sit tight," Carver said, and strolled back to the desk, leaning against the counter and pulling out his phone to text his friends. "I'm telling you, Sarge, this guy was aggressive. Hit me with the whole, 'am I being detained' routine." Gable did not answer. He was staring at his monitor. The fingerprint system had returned a match, and not an ordinary one. Because Nathaniel Hayes held a top-level federal security clearance, his prints did not simply pull up a driver's license. They triggered a secure federal profile. The screen read, "Hayes, Nathaniel D. Status, clearance active. Employer, United States Department of Justice. Title, Deputy Chief, Civil Rights Division." Sergeant Gable felt the blood leave his face. He read it once. He read it again. Slowly, very slowly, he turned his head and looked through the reinforced glass at the man on the metal bench. The man in the blood-stained sweatshirt, who was, at that very moment, looking calmly back at him. "Carver," Gable said. His voice had gone thin. "Yeah, Sarge?" Carver did not look up from his phone. "You get his real name? Probably got warrants out somewhere, right?" Gable stood. He crossed to the young officer, took him by the arm, and steered him behind the desk, pointing at the monitor. "Read it," he said quietly. "Read the screen." Carver frowned, annoyed, and looked. His eyes moved across the words. United States Department of Justice, Deputy Chief, Civil Rights Division. The phone slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. "No," he breathed. "No, that's a mistake in the system. He was in a hoodie. He didn't have any ID. He was walking in his own neighborhood," Gable said, keeping his voice low so it would not carry to the officers in the back. "You stopped, took down, and arrested a federal prosecutor, a deputy chief of the Civil Rights Division. Do you understand what that division does, Carver? They investigate departments like this one. They send officers to federal prison." Carver looked as though the floor had dropped out from under him. He resisted. He wouldn't give me his ID. "Be quiet," Gable said. He looked again at the man behind the glass. You put your hands on him. You hurt him. And you had nothing. No crime, no cause, nothing. He reached for the station's secure line, and his hand was not entirely steady. He skipped past the lieutenant and dialed the direct number of Chief Gregory Walsh. It was 1:15 in the morning. Walsh answered on the fourth ring, thick with sleep. Gable, this had better be an emergency. Chief! His voice cracked on the word. You need to come down to the station, right now, and call the city attorney on your way. What happened, Lewis? Officer Carver brought in a man on a street stop. Failure to identify. It got physical. But Chief, he swallowed hard. The man in that holding cell is Nathaniel Hayes. He's the deputy chief of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, and he's asked for his phone call. There was a long, terrible silence on the line. When Chief Walsh finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. Do not speak to him. Do not touch him. I'm leaving now. The line went dead. Inside the holding cell, Nathaniel Hayes touched his swollen lip with his cuffed hands, looked up at the small camera mounted in the corner of the room, and allowed himself the smallest, most patient of smiles. Chief Gregory Walsh came through the back doors of the station at 1:45, and he was not the man his officers were used to seeing. Ordinarily, he wore his authority like a pressed uniform. Tonight his shirt was untucked, his tie was gone, and his face had gone the color of ash. He walked straight past the front desk and into the supervisor's office, and he closed the door. Sergeant Gable was already on his feet. Officer Carver sat in the corner with his head in his hands. Where is he? Walsh asked, his voice low and tight. Holding cell 3, Gable said. He hasn't made a sound. He hasn't even asked to clean up his face. Did anyone question him? Read him his rights? No, sir. The second the prince came back, I shut everything down. Nobody has spoken to him. Walsh closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. Then he turned to Carver and pointed. Pull the dash camera and the body camera. Now I want to see exactly what happened before the city attorney gets here. Gable logged into the secure server and brought up the synchronized video. The three men crowded around the glow of the monitor. The footage began on the quiet, empty street. The spotlight came up, washing out the picture for an instant before it adjusted. And there stood Nathaniel Hayes in his Georgetown sweatshirt, near the sidewalk, bent over his shoe. Walsh watched in silence as the audio began. He heard Carver's rapid, aggressive commands. He heard Nathaniel's calm, precise recitation of his rights. And then he watched the takedown, and he flinched. Stop it there, Walsh said, his voice hollow. He turned on Carver, and his eyes were hard. You had no reasonable suspicion. He was walking. He wasn't looking into cars. He gave you his address. You skipped every step of de-escalation we have ever trained into you, and you put your hands on a deputy chief of the Justice Department because he knew the law better than you did, and it made you feel small. Chief, Carver's voice broke. He was in a hoodie. We've had package thefts out in Somerset. Package thefts, Walsh said. At midnight, you have handed the federal government the keys to this city. The office door opened, and Arthur Pendleton, the city attorney, slipped inside. Pendleton was a sharp, careful lawyer who had spent a long career making misconduct complaints quietly go away. But when he looked at the frozen image on the screen, Nathaniel Hayes on the ground, he did not look sharp or careful. He looked ill. I got your message, Greg, Pendleton said, loosening his collar. Tell me the fingerprint hit was a glitch. It's him, Arthur, Walsh said. Nathaniel Hayes, Civil Rights Division. Pendleton exhaled slowly and began to pace the small room. Do you have any idea who this man is? He isn't just a lawyer. He's the one they send when a whole department needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. He led the federal agreement in one city. He dismantled a corrupt unit in another. If he raises his hand, the Attorney General answers the phone. We need to get him out of that cell. Tonight. We release him. We apologize. We offer to cover his medical bills, and we pray he doesn't walk straight to the press. We can't just unarrest him, Gable said uneasily. He's already in the system. There's a paper trail. Then we call it a detainment error, not an arrest, Pendleton said. Chief, you and I are going in there, and we are going to be as respectful as two men have ever been in the history of this building. Walsh smoothed his hair, buttoned his collar, and took the cell keys from the desk. "Carver, you stay here. If you so much as look at that man, I will end your career myself." Walsh and Pendleton walked down the fluorescent hallway toward the holding area. The station was so quiet they could hear their own footsteps. They stopped outside cell 3. Through the glass, Nathaniel sat in exactly the same position as he had an hour before, his posture straight, the blood on his chin dried to a dark line across the Georgetown letters. Walsh unlocked the heavy door and pulled it open. "Mr. Hayes." Walsh's voice was warm now, soothing, diplomatic. "I'm Chief Gregory Walsh. This is Arthur Pendleton, our city attorney. There has been a terrible misunderstanding tonight, and I cannot begin to tell you how deeply sorry I am for the way you've been treated." He stepped forward, holding out the small key. "Let's get those off you right now, sir. You are free to go. We have a car out front to take you home, or to a hospital, whichever you prefer. Officer Carver has been suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation." Nathaniel did not offer his wrists. He simply looked up, his dark eyes settling on Walsh with a calm that filled the whole room. "Am I being formally unarrested, Chief Walsh?" Walsh and Pendleton exchanged a glance. "We are voiding the arrest," Pendleton said, forcing a small, professional smile. "It was an unlawful detainment based on a young officer's poor judgment. It will not appear on your record, Mr. Hayes. We are clearing the slate tonight." "No," Nathaniel said quietly. The word hung in the cold air of the cell. "I'm sorry?" Walsh said. "I said no." Nathaniel leaned forward. "You will not void the arrest. You will not delete the booking log. You will process my paperwork. Failure to identify, resisting arrest, all of it. You will take my photograph. And you will hold me here until a judge sets my bail in the morning." Pendleton's smile faded. "Mr. Hayes, please, be reasonable. We are trying to make this right. You don't want an arrest on your record." "My record is spotless," Nathaniel said, and his voice rose just enough to command the room. "But your department's record is not. I want the paper trail. I want the timestamps. I want the dash camera footage preserved as evidence, not conveniently lost in a system reboot in the morning." He stood. Even in handcuffs, he seemed to fill the small cell entirely. "You believed you could take a man off the street, put him in a cage, discover who he worked for, and then simply open the door as though nothing had happened." His eyes moved between the two men. Officer Carver did not make a mistake tonight. He did exactly what he was trained to do. He saw a man he decided did not belong, and he manufactured a reason to act. The only thing that went wrong for him is that he chose the wrong man. "Mr. Hayes," Walsh said, and the last of his composure gave way to something close to pleading. "We will terminate him. You have my word. Just let us take the cuffs off." "Leave them on," Nathaniel said, "because if you release me now, without processing, you are admitting to something far worse than an arrest. Process it, Chief Walsh." He sat back down on the metal bench and closed his eyes. "I'll see you in court." The two men stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the man in the blood-stained sweatshirt, and understood at last that they were not looking at a victim. They were looking at a man who had been waiting for exactly this. The morning sun broke over the Capitol and threw long shadows across the limestone face of the great Justice Department building. On the 5th floor, in a secure conference room, the air was charged with quiet, controlled fury. Nathaniel Hayes sat at the head of a long mahogany table. The handcuffs were gone, replaced by a dark, flawlessly tailored suit. The only marks left from the night were a swollen lower lip and a small bandage on his cheek. Across from him sat Diane Foster, the Assistant Attorney General who ran the entire Civil Rights Division, a formidable prosecutor who had spent a career taking apart corrupt institutions. She was staring at high-resolution photographs of Nathaniel's injured face and the deep bruising around his wrists. "They processed the arrest," Nathaniel said, tapping a thick folder. "I posted bond at 8 this morning. They charged me with resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. Both misdemeanors." The judge looked at my credentials, looked at my face, and nearly came down off the bench to apologize personally. Diane set the photographs down with deliberate care. "I want the bureau in Somerset by noon. I want the hard drive secured. I want the dispatch logs pulled. And I want that officer's badge on my desk." "Diane," Nathaniel said, leaning forward, "look at the bigger picture. He slid a second, much thicker binder across the table. The cover read, Somerset Municipal Police, Pedestrian and Traffic Stop Data, 2021 to 2026. She frowned and opened it. What is this? For the past several months, I've quietly had my clerks running data on the small suburban departments that operate on the edges of the capital, Nathaniel said, his voice steady and precise. Somerset came back as a statistical outlier. Black and Hispanic residents make up about 9% of that population, and yet they account for roughly 72% of all pedestrian stops and use of force incidents in the town. Diane looked up, and understanding moved across her face. I couldn't get authorization to open a formal pattern or practice investigation, Nathaniel went on, because we didn't have a complaining witness who could survive what a police union would do to him. It was all just numbers. The local public defenders were pleading these cases out before they ever reached us. We needed the right plaintiff, someone with no criminal history, someone who knew the law inside and out, someone who could not be discredited. Diane stared at him.
Nathaniel.
Tell me you did not walk out there and let that happen. I took a walk in my own neighborhood, Nathaniel said, and his voice was quiet and grave. I did nothing wrong, and I broke no law, but I knew the odds, Diane. The moment that spotlight came on, I understood exactly what was in front of me. And Officer Carver has now given us the one thing all those statistics never could. He set his hands flat on the table. Under the law, a city can be held responsible for the constitutional violations of its officers when those violations are the result of an official policy or a widespread accepted custom. Carver's actions, the instant escalation, the false arrest, the complete confidence that his department would back him, those were not the actions of a man improvising. They were the actions of a man who had done this before and knew he would be protected. I intend to file a federal civil rights lawsuit against Officer Mitchell Carver, Chief Gregory Walsh, and the city of Somerset. I'm going to ask for $12 million, but the money is leverage. We use the discovery process to open their internal files, their training manuals, their disciplinary records. And once we have what's inside, the department steps in and negotiates a federal agreement to rebuild the whole force. Diane Foster smiled, a sharp, dangerous smile. Draft the complaint. I'll speak with the Attorney General. By the following Tuesday, the lawsuit had been filed in federal court, and the effect was immediate. At 10 o'clock that morning, Nathaniel stood on the courthouse steps and faced a wall of reporters. He did not speak with the raw anger of a wronged man. He spoke with the measured precision of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. On Friday night, I was arrested and held by an officer who had sworn an oath to defend the Constitution, he told them. His bruised face carried onto every news broadcast in the country. But understand, this case is not really about me. This case is about the thousands of citizens who do not have the platform, the legal training, or the resources to fight back when the power of the state is turned against them for no reason at all. That is what ends today. Across town, the city government was coming apart at the seams. Mayor Philip Caldwell was pacing his office in front of Chief Walsh and Arthur Pendleton, the muted television in the corner showing footage of the Somerset station cut against Nathaniel's face. $12 million, Caldwell said, and he dropped a copy of the complaint onto his desk. The city's entire discretionary budget for the year isn't $12 million. Our insurance carrier called me 20 minutes ago. They're threatening to drop our coverage completely. And if they drop us, gentlemen, this city cannot legally operate a police force at all. Philip, we are trying to contain the damage, Pendleton said. We didn't suspend Carver. We terminated him this morning. For cause. We're hoping that shows the judge good faith. Good faith, the mayor repeated. Have you read page 47, Arthur? He has subpoenaed the personnel file of every officer in the department. He wants 5 years of email between the chief's office and the patrol division. He doesn't want a check. He wants to put this entire city under federal supervision. Chief Walsh sat in a leather chair, looking a decade older than he had the week before. We can't fight him, Philip. I've watched the video. It's indefensible. If this reaches a jury, they won't just award the $12 million. They'll add damages that could bankrupt us. Then settle it, the mayor said. Give him whatever he asks. Make it go away. But Nathaniel Hayes had never intended to let it go away. Over the following 6 weeks, the The discovery process opened the Somerset Police Department like a book that had been kept locked for years. Nathaniel's legal team, backed quietly by the full weight of the Justice Department, uncovered a remarkable record. They found messages between shift supervisors, urging officers to focus on people who looked out of place in the wealthier neighborhoods. They found complaints from residents that had been quietly filed away and never acted upon, and they found that Officer Carver had 3 earlier complaints of using excessive force, every one of them ignored. Facing certain defeat in federal court, the city of Somerset gave up the fight. It agreed to a settlement of $8.5 million, but the money was the smallest part of it. As a condition of the agreement, the city invited the Department of Justice to conduct a top-to-bottom review of its police force. Chief Gregory Walsh was pushed into an early and unhappy retirement. Sergeant Lewis Gable was demoted permanently to a desk, and Mitchell Carver, the young officer who had wanted, more than anything, to make a name for himself, got his wish in the cruelest possible way. He was charged by a federal grand jury with depriving a citizen of his rights, and he faced years in a federal prison. On a quiet Friday evening 2 months after the settlement was finalized, Nathaniel Hayes stepped out of his own front door on Cumberland Avenue. He wore his faded navy Georgetown sweatshirt, his gray sweatpants, and his running shoes. The bruise had long since faded. He walked down his driveway, turned onto the sidewalk, and began his 2-mile loop. A Somerset patrol cruiser rolled slowly down the street. The new officer behind the wheel saw the tall man in the sweatshirt walking in the dark. He did not speed up. He did not reach for the spotlight. He kept his hands at 10 and 2, drove past at the speed limit, and disappeared into the night. Nathaniel pulled his hood up against the chill, put his hands in his pockets, and finished his walk in peace. But that quiet walk, it turned out, was not the end of the story. It was only the calm before a second storm. Because in the close, guarded world of small-town law enforcement, a federal settlement is only a piece of paper. The real power in Somerset had never sat in the mayor's office. It sat in the meeting hall of the local police fraternal order, and the men who ran it were not finished. Frank Sullivan was the union president, a broad-shouldered man of 60 with a red face and a firm grip on local politics. He did not see Carver's indictment as a house being set in order. He saw it as a threat to every officer who wore a badge. If a young man could be sent to federal prison for a street stop that had gotten out of hand, Sullivan reasoned, then no officer anywhere was safe. They threw that kid to the wolves to save their own pensions, Sullivan told a closed meeting of 200 off-duty officers, his fist coming down on the podium. The Justice Department thinks it can walk into our town, ruin a young man's life, and hold the rest of us hostage. We do not roll over. The retaliation began quietly. It was designed to wear Nathaniel down before Carver's trial began. It started with the patrols. At 2 o'clock every morning, a Somerset cruiser would roll slowly down Cumberland Avenue, come to a stop directly in front of Nathaniel's driveway, and sit there, engine idling, for 5 full minutes. The officers never stepped out. They never turned on their lights. They simply sat, a silent message, delivered night after night. We know where you live. Then the response times changed. When Susan Abernathy, Nathaniel's neighbor and the witness to that first night, called to report a suspicious vehicle near her garage, it took the police 45 minutes to arrive. When they finally did, they were curt and dismissive, and they left after only a few minutes. The message to the whole street was clear enough. Support the prosecutor, and you are on your own. Sullivan also brought in a defense lawyer for Carver, Maxwell Davies, a shrewd and combative attorney, paid entirely out of the union's funds. Davies was a master of the press. He began feeding carefully shaped stories to friendly radio hosts and local papers. The headlines shifted. Did a Justice Department insider set up a rookie cop? The trap on Cumberland Avenue. Davies hired investigators to comb through Nathaniel's entire career, looking for anyone with a grudge, any old grievance that could be turned into a weapon on the witness stand. The pressure mounted. One evening in late November, Nathaniel was sitting in his living room reviewing exhibits when a sudden burst of light swept across his front windows. He rose and pulled the blinds aside in time to see a dark SUV speeding away with its headlights off. On his front lawn sat a heavy stone, and wrapped around it was a copy of the union's newsletter. Its headline circled in thick red marker, "The Enemy Within." The next morning, Nathaniel walked into the Justice Department, and he did not stop at his own office. He went straight to Diane Foster's suite, set the stone and the circled newsletter on her glass desk, and let them land with a sharp, deliberate sound. "They aren't backing down, Diane," he said, his voice low and even. "Sullivan is running a coordinated intimidation campaign. He's frightening my neighbors. He's trying to make me withdraw my testimony against Carver." Diane looked at the stone, and her eyes narrowed. She had spent her career dismantling organized crime and corrupt institutions, and she knew these tactics when she saw them. "They think they're dealing with an ordinary civilian," she said, leaning back. "They've forgotten who they declared war on." "I want to escalate," Nathaniel said. "No more settlements. I want the Bureau's Public Corruption Unit looking at Frank Sullivan. I want the union's financial records. And I want Sergeant Louis Gable." Diane raised an eyebrow. "Gable? He was demoted, not fired." "Exactly," Nathaniel said, beginning to pace. "He's a 20-year man sitting at a desk, watching his career drain away, because he covered for a rookie. He knows where every problem in that department is buried. If the union is using off-book money to harass me, Gable knows how those orders move. We put the pressure on Gable, he turns on Sullivan, and the whole wall comes down." Diane reached for her phone. "I'll have the warrants in front of a judge within the hour. It's time we showed them what a federal task force actually looks like." The federal courthouse was a fortress of limestone and marble, a world away from the gray cinder block station where the whole affair had begun. The trial of the United States of America. Mitchell Carver was the most closely watched civil rights case in years. The gallery was full to the walls, reporters, law students, and rows of off-duty officers in matching union shirts, watching the prosecution table with hard eyes. Mitchell Carver sat beside his union-funded lawyer, Maxwell Davies. The young man looked pale and thin. The confidence that had defined him that October night was entirely gone. Nathaniel Hayes took the stand on the third day. In a charcoal suit, his back straight, he looked every inch the senior federal prosecutor he was. Davies rose for cross-examination, and he came out swinging, intending to take Nathaniel's credibility apart in front of the jury. "Mr. Hayes," Davies began, his tone edged with condescension, "you are an expert in civil rights law, are you not?" "I am." "You've lectured on police procedure. You know precisely what the law requires for a lawful stop. You know exactly what an officer is trained to look for." He paced in front of the jury box. "So isn't it true, Mr. Hayes, that on the night in question, you deliberately made yourself appear suspicious? You wore dark clothing, you put your hood up, you declined to show identification, knowing full well how an inexperienced officer would react. You wanted a confrontation, didn't you?" "Objection. Argumentative," the government's lead attorney called out. "Overruled." "I'll allow it," said Judge Albert Covington, peering over his glasses. Nathaniel leaned toward the microphone. He did not look at Davies. He looked at the jury. "I was wearing a sweatshirt in October, Mr. Davies. I was tying my shoe on a public sidewalk 3 blocks from my home, and I calmly asserted my right not to be detained without cause. If an officer becomes violent because a citizen quietly exercises the rights guaranteed to him by the Constitution, then the problem is not with the citizen." A murmur ran through the courtroom. "You ruined my client's life," Davies shot back, his composure slipping. "Your client put a man on the ground and placed him in handcuffs for walking home in his own neighborhood," Nathaniel answered, and his voice carried to the far corners of the high-ceilinged room. "He ruined his own life." But the deciding blow did not come from Nathaniel. It came the next morning, in a moment that sent a shock through the entire state. The prosecution called Sergeant Louis Gable to the stand. When Gable walked through the double doors, the officers in the gallery went silent and still. Frank Sullivan, seated in the second row, went pale. Gable had reached an agreement with the Bureau just 2 days earlier, his testimony in exchange for protection from far more serious charges. He took the oath with unsteady hands and sat down in the witness box, and he did not look at Carver or at Sullivan. "Sergeant Gable," the prosecutor asked, "are you familiar with the phrase, Containment Patrol, within the Somerset Police Department. Gable swallowed. Yes, it was an unwritten, off-the-books instruction, pushed by the union leadership and tolerated by the former chief. We were told to give extra scrutiny to any minority seen in the Somerset neighborhoods after dark. The idea was to make them uncomfortable, to make sure they knew they were being watched, so they wouldn't come back. Carver lowered his face into his hands. Davies slumped in his chair. And did Officer Carver act on his own the night he arrested Nathaniel Hayes? No, Gable said, and his voice cracked. He was doing exactly what the union president, Frank Sullivan, told the young officers to do. Be aggressive. Establish control. I watched the dash camera video that night. Carver wasn't an exception. He was the product of a system that all of us helped build. The gallery erupted. Judge Covington brought his gavel down hard, warning that he would clear the room. Sullivan came half out of his seat, his face dark with anger, and 2 federal marshals stepped in behind him and eased him back down. From there, the defense unraveled. Gable's testimony opened the floodgates. He turned over encrypted union messages showing that Sullivan had ordered the 2 o'clock patrols outside Nathaniel's house. He laid bare the entire intimidation campaign. By the end of the week, the jury needed less than 4 hours. The foreperson, a middle-aged schoolteacher, rose to read the verdict. On the charge of depriving a citizen of his rights under color of law, we find the defendant, Mitchell Carver, guilty. On the charge of falsifying a police report, we find the defendant guilty. As the marshals moved in with handcuffs, the very same cold steel Carver had once so casually snapped onto another man's wrists, the young officer wept. And as Carver was led away, federal agents rose from the gallery and quietly surrounded Frank Sullivan. The union president was placed under arrest for witness intimidation and conspiracy to violate a citizen's civil rights. The man who had run the wall of silence in Somerset for 20 years was, at last, brought out from behind it. Nathaniel Hayes walked out of the courthouse and down the wide granite steps into a crisp evening that felt very much like the one on which this whole ordeal had begun. Cameras flashed. Reporters called out their questions. He gave a brief, satisfied nod, but he did not stop to speak. He had not only won his case, he had reached into a city and pulled out the rot that had spread through it, root and branch. For years he had stood in courtrooms and argued that justice was more than a word. Now, on a cold and ordinary night, walking home in a faded sweatshirt, he could finally say that he had made it real, not with anger and not with force, but with patience, with the law, and with an unshakable belief that no man should ever be judged unworthy simply for walking home.